We have been dealing in the medieval era, which I have said has a troubled history with historians who sometimes, or have in the past, referred to it as the so-called Dark Ages. It's first called that by people in the Renaissance following that, who just, sort of like how you think your grandparents are kind of cool, but your parents are just total squares. Generationally, they didn't want to think about the people immediately preceding them, because they, of course, surpassed them in every way. But it was a very rich time and a very complicated time. Not just, a brutal time, but a time with some remarkable characteristics. One of the most prominent developments in the Western world in this period was the creation of Islam as a development out of breakaway sect of the earlier Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, I don't need to go into the specifics of Muhammad coming down and and delivering the Quran, but some of the characteristics of it that developed out of it were pretty interesting. One of them was that, and this is a dynamic thing, so it's much more complicated than I'm suggesting, but in general, one of the motivations that the early followers and formers of Islam was that Christianity made God a little too approachable. Christianity took the God of the Hebrew Bible, who had kind of this split personality where sometimes in those early chapters of Genesis you can see they're talking about him walking, and when he comes back from a walk to the Garden of Eden and finds out and sees Adam and Eve there, he has to ask, "What have you two been up to?" Well, you're God, shouldn't you know? God seemed somewhat limited in that way. But also, just the fact that God went for a walk makes him oddly human-ish, whatever. Christianity developed that and made God even more so by giving him a son. A human-ish son. One who, went strolling down the streets, hanging out, had friends. Started talking about how, God is all embracing, God is all merciful, God's your buddy. That was a little bit too approachable. The early Islamic tradition wanted to emphasize God's awesome unknowability. Because when they looked around, that's what they saw. They saw nature as overwhelming. They saw the universe as incomprehensible. They felt themselves really quite small. Part of that came out in art. To this day, it is highly offensive in the Islamic tradition to portray figures, human figures. Specifically, you cannot obviously have any portraiture of Muhammad. You cannot have any image of God himself in any form. It needs to be abstract if you're going to reference in any way. So it cannot be a real reference. The idea is that if you paint a picture of God as, you know, the Greeks had statues of the gods all over the place. If you portray God in art, it makes him too knowable. So they developed pattern art, where the shapes and the patterns are remarkably intricate, interconnected. And you start staring at it and you can get lost. You start looking for the patterns. You start looking for the shapes within shapes within shapes. And you find yourself uncertain. There is no way to make sense of it. There is no way for the human mind to grasp the full pattern. There is no way for the human mind to grasp the genius at play in the design. When you admit that to yourself, it's humbling. And that's the pose you're supposed to take when considering the works of God.
But a person made this, right?
What's that?
A person made this?
I presume so, yeah. Human beings make these things, but human beings are not supposed to claim any control over the divine realm. And to portray something is to exercise control over it. You paint a picture of God, you have control over him. What does he look like? What's he doing? How big is he? What's his relation to everything around him? Might seem innocent to you, but you're saying that you know what God looks like. Which is kind of like saying you're on the same level. Around this time also, remember this? Map of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire throughout the Middle Ages was withering away. The central organization through Rome had long since dissipated, and you were getting multiple power centers around the Mediterranean. Still in Rome in the form of as we move forward, of the Catholic Church, with the Pope as its head, has its home base in Rome. But you start getting nations developing. France becomes a real thing. We talked about how London became a real country. Germany was this weird, disparate chunk of barbarians. But you're starting to see nations evolve. And with that, you get a lot of people throughout the Middle Ages who were able to take advantage of all these red lines on the map, which is the Roman system of roads. They were able to move around. They were able to travel And if you pick something up on your travels, you can go home and say, hey, look what I found. What'll you give me for it? We've never seen anything like this before. That's got to be worth a lot. Trade develops on scales ever increasing. A handy little instrument, first developed in China at the end of the classical age, the compass. The compass lets you go places. The compass lets you sail places. You can get back to Asia. You can buy a lot of their stuff. You can take it back with you to Europe and say, look what I just brought from Asia. It's pretty cool. So people are moving around in a degree that they had never done before. People are wandering. People are trading. People are exchanging more than just goods. They're exchanging ideas. The insularity of the medieval age, brought on somewhat by feudalism, is a bit of a myth. Yes, the vast majority of people were born, lived, and died within the same 3 miles. And they didn't get very many places. But more and more, people were moving around. People were able to travel. People were able to exchange ideas. And when you do that, you start to get a bit more perspective. The overwhelmingness that you see in certain forms of art, where you're just forced to consider yourself as small and insignificant, that starts to give way. You take the small town boy, and he looks out at the big world, and he feels overwhelmed. But if he goes out into that world, if he starts to figure a few things out, the world is not so unknowable anymore. And he starts to realize that. In art, the dignity of man, if we can say it, is, let's say, on an upswing throughout the late Middle Ages. This is by an Italian painter named Cimabue, which I highly recommend everybody trying to pronounce once. It's a lot of fun. Makes your lips tingle. Cimabue. Florentine, meaning from the city of Florence. I'm blanking on the year that he was born. He was like a generation or so older than Dante. One of the most successful painters of the late Middle Ages. But obviously, at the time, religious art was prominent, specifically, in this case, the Catholic tradition. The church, as an institution, was pretty much the only thing around that had the money to pay artists, so most of the art we get from that era has religious themes. You know, artists are commerce people too. They paint what sells. I saw this once. I was wandering around in Florence, and I went into the, I think it's the Basilica of Santa Croce. I'm not sure. I don't know where my kids were at that point. That I would have just quiet time to myself. But I went in and I sat down and I just stared at this thing. And it was up over the altar. It's not super large, but it's impressively large. 176.4 inches by 153.5 inches. I'm not sure how big that is, but it's significant. I was able to sit from, a few pews back and could see it just fine. But I'm sitting there and I'm staring at it, and, you get lost for a few minutes in just how old it is and how it's still just sort of sitting there in this middle of this church that people are wandering in and out of. I mean, shouldn't this be, air-conditioned, heavily secure museum room or something like that? Italy is weird about accessibility to its art. But you're sitting there and you're staring at it and you're starting to realize that, there's a lot going on here. On the one hand, you get a lot of very clear, which isn't so easy to see here, but a lot of musculature. Jesus was really quite cut here. In that way, it's very realistic. But look a little closer. Get a load of how long this torso is. I don't know how tall he is in this portrayal, or how tall he's supposed to be, but that waist is ridiculously long. The nose is like 2/3 the length of his face. And that posture, now, okay, he's being tortured. This is not supposed to be a comfortable position, but that posture looks really quite almost impossible to replicate on a human body. It's human, but abstract at the same time. They don't want to make him look too human. When I was sitting there in the basilica, I remember focusing in on that waistline and thinking, it's almost as if, see, this is just hurtful doing this. It's almost as if you could see his soul leaving his body through his belly button, which is my little interpretation. But the point is, it's not human. It's not supposed to be. He's not a human being. He's the Son of God. Generation later, Giotto di Bondone. Also a Florentine, friend of Cimabue, or at least a colleague. You never know how buddy people are. Especially, if Cimabue is top dog in the Florentine art scene for quite a while, and this little snot comes along and starts saying, well, no, I'm pretty good too. Dante actually talks about that later on. We'll get to that. Here, a little less cut, not making it to the gym as much, but the posture is a little bit more recognizable. The posture isn't going out of its way to be strange. The faces around them of ordinary people are remarkable. They are very human. Look at the suffering, not just on Christ, but on the people around him. Relatively ordinary people. I like the personality on this guy right here, the side eye. This is recognizable humanity. This guy is probably going to be at your Thanksgiving dinner in another couple of weeks. It's easy to recognize them. They are approachable that way. These are ordinary faces you would see every day. The world of art is suddenly becoming less concerned with making things unknowable, unidentifiable, unapproachable. The world of art is now saying, well, okay, you know, God is great, but human beings aren't nothing. You know, we got our chops. We built the compass. We can travel all over the world now. We got some schmats. We can have recognizably human faces. That one. Recognizably human faces incorporated into a vision of Christ, who does not look dramatically different than the others. Does that mean they're equal? If God is supposed to be supreme and way above everybody else, what does it mean to suddenly say that, well, you know, humans can be sort of close? We can start to bunch them together a little. That split between the medieval and the Renaissance, which I'll get to, is what we're talking about. In the medieval world, God was distant. In the Renaissance, man gets lifted up. Not quite on the same level, but he's no longer overwhelmed by God. This is another painting by Giotto. This is his portrait of his friend Dante Alighieri. We refer to him pretty much exclusively as Dante. But like Cimabue, I highly recommend everybody try once in their life to pronounce Alighieri. It's fun. I love Italian. I'm going to be going on about that. Alighieri. Dante Alighieri. Hey! I took Italian in high school, and I was the only kid in there who was not named Anthony, and my teacher made fun of me for it in a very good-humored way, and I just love pronouncing stuff. I never learned to speak a word of it, but, well, you know, a little bit. But, you know, the pronunciation was fun. Hey! What do we think of this guy? It's a pretty good likeness. In that, you know, it's not like I know him personally, but you know, again, this is very recognizably human features. This is not something particularly abstract. This is somebody you would see just wandering around. I think I waited behind that guy at Starbucks this morning. Take a look at one other by a painter who came a little bit later, a guy named Botticelli. What do we think of him? If you had to pick one adjective to describe this person, what would it be? Would it be complimentary? Is this somebody you want to hang around with? Is he a fun guy? Probably not. That cold, dead-eye stare, the chin sticking out, and of course that aristocratic nose that is just so used to looking down on other people. There is a park across the street from Lincoln Center called Dante Park where there's a statue of him in the middle. It's just one of those little tiny like triangle parks where I think it's at Amsterdam Avenue and Broadway Cross. I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's Columbus. I don't know. Right in front of Lincoln Center. And I like going there every now and then and just staring up at him because he is on this huge pedestal in the middle of the park and he's just glowering down on people. And I like to think about the people who are going into Lincoln Center to go see, you know, the opera, the ballet, the symphony, all of these high cultural activities, generally afforded only by the well-off people who think themselves pretty special to begin with. And hanging out over all of them is Dante saying, "You peasants." Dante. A couple of years ago, my youngest daughter, for childcare reasons, had to come to one of my classes. And she was probably around 5 then, I'm guessing, not really sure. Maybe even younger. And that class happened to be on Dante. And to this day, she can tell you, you ask her anything at all about Dante, she will tell you one thing. She will tell you his nickname. Because that's all she remembered, because she didn't read it. You know, she wasn't a particularly strong reader at 4 or whatever the hell she was here. But she will tell you that his nickname was Il Nazino. The nose. Dante Alighieri. Born roughly 1265, you know, records not so great back then. In the city of Florence, in Italy, they call it Firenze. He came from a good family, relatively aristocratic, got a education, but relatively poor. Last generation or so, I've been a little hard on the family. Didn't have a lot to fall back on. So you had this guy who, well educated, good background, but needed to make a living. Couldn't just, you know, go buy himself a country estate and sip wine for the rest of his life. Had to make a living. Became a politician and a diplomat. If you're good at writing letters and good at, you know, thinking on your feet, it's a natural fit. As a politician, he developed an unfortunate habit of having ideas of his own. And sometimes those ideas got him in trouble. He had a particular axe to grind against the Catholic Church. Always a risky prospect in Italy. Primarily, he wasn't anti-Catholic in any way. He was a very devout Catholic, of course. But he objected to the way the Catholic Church, and particularly a series of popes in this era, were gobbling up power and money in the worldly realm. According to Dante, the role of the church should be exclusively limited to matters of the soul, matters of religion, matters of dogma. They should not be power players on the world scene. All of those countries that we saw coming about in the late Middle Ages, they had people running them. And they had a connected but loosely connected relationship with the church and the authority of the Pope. Dante was very firm on the belief that the Pope should have his sphere, the kings and the princes should have theirs. They should be separate. Just off the top of your head, who might object to that? Who's got something to lose by going Dante's way? The church! Dante took the most powerful institution in the medieval world and made it an enemy. Some of this was on that, continental scale, fighting the church. Some of it was a little bit more fractious. He was a citizen of Florence, and Florence was a rising city in roughly the center of Italy. That was, let's say, on the upswing. Things were going pretty well. All of that trade, all of those goods, all of that money that was coming in from all around the world tended to flow through Italy. Italy was very conveniently handled or situated for that. It was sticking out into the Mediterranean. You could get from Italy to North Africa, or even parts of, Western Asia, going through the Black Sea, pretty easily through ships in Italian ports. Countries like Germany, France, England, they had ports, but those ports tended to let out onto the ocean. The ocean is rough. The ocean is where cargoes can get sunk and you lose all your money. Italy, warm weather ports year round. And so much closer than anything else. So Florence was awash in money. When you take a lot of money and pump it into a place, nothing but good happens, right? Yeah! The city became, well, let's not throw around words like corruption lightly, but it was corrupt. Everybody was making a lot of money, and rivalries that go from, just petty little, nothing rivalries like you find on any small town or village council. you put some money behind all of that, and suddenly those rivalries, those factions really dig in. And when you take firm positions on matters of ecclesiastical or worldly power and start grading them against that moneyed interest, things happen. Dante, as part of his role as a diplomat, which I have to imagine he was fairly good at. I mean, even if he seems a little pompous, he was a genius. And the role of a diplomat is generally about using language, using words, writing letters, meeting people, expressing your position, and negotiating deals. I would imagine he was pretty good at that. But one day, he was sent on an embassy, on a mission to the Vatican in Rome. And son of a gun, while he was gone, they voted to exile him. The city leaders of Florence said, "We don't want him back. If he comes back, we will kill him." That's harsh. It was even more harsh because the faction that drove him out, I don't need to get into the real politics of it, but the faction that drove him out were largely his in-laws. His wife's family were the higher-ups of the opposing party. And they voted to kick him out. Now, granted, he couldn't have been a lot of fun around the holidays, and, everybody has that uncle that, oh God, he's here again. But they voted to kick him out. His wife and kids, I think he had 4 kids, stayed in Florence. He was just told, you can't come back. So it wasn't just a political rejection, they took his whole family, too. He wasn't allowed to come back and pack a bag, pick up his things. In a world before credit cards or really much cash, he was literally cast out into the wolves.
Did he have to come back to find that out and then leave again, or someone
I'm not sure. Word traveled slowly in the year 1302. He did not get it as a text. He spent the rest of his life wandering around. He spent the rest of his life living on charity. When you are a diplomat by profession, you gotta have somebody to be diplomatic for. And if you make enemies of everybody, they're not gonna hire you anymore. So he never had a lot of money to begin with. He had worked through the sheer force of his own genius to build up a life. By the time he was early 30s, mid-30s, and all of that was ripped away, stolen from him. Just think how that felt. I mean, here was a guy who was used to wandering around the capitals of Europe. There weren't that many capitals, so but he was probably used to being in rooms with the most sophisticated people in any city, the best educated, it goes without saying, the wealthiest and the most aristocratic. And he probably, again, look at that expression, was used to being the smartest guy in the room. when you take the guy who's used to being the smartest guy in the room and you cast him out and say, nah, you get nothing. Your whole life is over. Go wander around. Maybe one day you'll feed the wolves. Other than that, we don't want to know. It's humiliating. He was not necessarily a sit back and take it kind of guy. He had obviously a good sense of his own abilities, his own talents. And like any human being, when somebody hits him hard, he wanted to hit back. When he was wandering around the countryside, he would go to the wealthier citizens that he could find. He tended to hang out. He wandered all over the place, to be perfectly honest. He ultimately settled in an area called Ravenna, which is over on the Adriatic on the east coast. Nice little beachside town. Had a nice lunch there once. Very good. But he would go to the wealthiest people there and say, you know, you, sir, we are both aristocrats, of course, and you have this beautiful house with all this room. My accounts are a little confused right now. How about you let me, go crash in your back room, give me a couple of meals a day, and in trade, I'll write some poems for you, and I'll tell all of posterity what a great guy you are. You know, I'll write poems about how brilliant you are and how you are a great, great man. This was a very well-established model, and lots of wealthy people like to have people around them remind them how great they are. And so it wasn't a bad way to make a living. So he would attach himself to these wealthy houses, these wealthy aristocrats, and he would write. When a diplomat has nobody to diplomat to, he's left to writing, just a piece of paper, and the hope that that piece of paper will find its way to readers. And through that, he found his way to get back. He found his way for revenge. He found his way to rise above and sink below everybody who had ever screwed him. He did this in a series of works, most of which, he left unfinished. I'm sure we can all sympathize with that. You get a great idea and you start going, you kind of lose interest because you got this other great idea, and oh yeah, I'm going to do this. Yeah, all right, well that's not really going right. Oh, we're here, yeah, this idea. Searching for the perfect vehicle for expression. Writing short poems along the way. Engaging with friends. Developing your skills. But with every idea that he would start, take up working, and then just, move on from, he wasn't just quitting. He wasn't just getting lazy or getting distracted. He was building something new. One other thing I'm going to say and then we're going to take a break. Up until this time, all literate people in Europe wrote in Latin. It was the language of government across governments. It was the language of writing. If you wanted to be a respected scholar, you wrote in Latin. If you wanted to be able to talk to somebody from a different country, chances are you wrote in Latin. They would have their little dialect from it. You would have yours, but you could always just all backtrack to Latin. It's formal, it's structured, everybody with an education knew it. But of course, throughout this time, Latin was branching out into what we now have as the Romance languages. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. All of these little variants were branching out. And in fact, those categories themselves are completely artificial, because within each of them there were multiple variations. And if you went wandering around Italy, as Dante used to when he was a diplomat, you could go up north to Milan and people would be speaking one way. Yeah, like, that's kind of a funny way to say something, you know. Maybe you tuck over to the east and you visit Venice and, whoa, what the? Totally different. And then God help you, if you go all the way down to Sicily, those people were speaking a completely different language. There was no controlling force. There was no organized Italian language. One of the reasons that Latin held its predominance and respect, well, you know, vernacular languages, as they came to be called, were just chaos. It's just, you know, lots of little enclaves of peasants gibbering to one another. But Dante and his generation were coming along and finding, like, well, you know, my particular dialect, I agree that, you know, most of those others are, you know, that's just a bunch of mutt languages. My particular dialect that we speak here in Florence, which is in a region or a state called Tuscany, that's pretty good. That sounds nice. You can sound sophisticated and educated when you speak that way. You don't have to always speak or write in Latin. There is something of value in the Tuscan dialect. One of the books that he started to write and ultimately did not finish was a book called De Vulgare Eloquentia, on the vulgar language, on the common language, arguing forcefully for Italian to be a legitimate poetic language, saying that it can be as noble as Latin, if done correctly. And you know he thinks he can do it correctly. One of the small ironies of that book, of course, is that he wrote this book extolling the virtues of the Tuscan dialect. He wrote it in Latin. A little hypocrisy there, maybe, who knows. He also wrote a book where he talks about, he makes some comments about the genius of Latin, and he wrote that in Italian. He's all over the place. He has these warring concepts in his head. classical Latin, the expressive power of the common language, the split between his aristocratic heritage and his status as an exile, the frustration he feels at the split between, or the lack of a split between papal authority and state authority, his personal anger at what had happened to him, and his faith and belief in the Christian ethic of forgiveness and meekness. All of these impulses were at war in him. All of these impulses were ripping him apart. All of these impulses, he's trying to negotiate, straddling multiple worlds at all times. Out of it comes the Divine Comedy. Out of it comes an attempt to resolve all of those splits, to knit together his view, his vision of the universe, to assert for himself as one person, to assert for himself the balls to say, I know how God designed the universe. It's a gutsy move. It would take him essentially the rest of his life. It was the only thing he did, really, for the rest of his life. He found a series of aristocrats with futons that he could crash on, and he would write. In between, he would extol the aristocrats to, keep the futon open. But he had this vision. He had this inspiration for how he was going to get back at his enemies, explain how the universe worked, and once and forever assert the dignity of man. Not on a parallel with God, but within the same frame. Not overwhelmed.